Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're back for another one of our LetPub series webinars. Some of you have been here before. Actually, probably a lot of you have been here before. Some of you are probably new. You can see our topic for today, addressing reviewer comments, resubmit your manuscript with confidence. I'll let our hosts introduce the rest for you and discuss what they're going to be going through for this topic. But I'm Dr. Clark Holdsworth, Senior Manager, Partnerships and Communications at LetPub, and I just want to go over with you before we start a variety of housekeeping items, let you know what we have for features on here so that we can get right into the content with our host. So first, I want you to take a look below. You can see that you have the chat. You can go into the chat, use it. Feel free throughout this session. I'll be leaving you some links, little tidbits, messages, reminders throughout the chat. So feel free to check that during the session. What I also want to point you to is the Q&A, which is different from the chat. So make sure if you do have any questions, the questions that you want answered at the end of this session in our extensive Q&A, make sure that they are going in there. The Q&A function has the upvote feature so that you can let us know what types of questions we should be pushing to the top. We're over 300 participants right now, so I suspect there's going to be a lot of questions. It's very helpful to me if you can go in, upvote things, make sure that we don't have a lot of redundancies. That way I can push the best or most popular questions right to the top. So be sure to use that. If you leave anything in the chat, we're probably not going to see it and be pulling it over from there. So in regards to a couple other items that you're going to get for follow-up for this, one common question that we have is about availability of the presentation. So I just want to remind you or let you know if it's your first time that these webinars are always available on demand. So by the act of signing up for this, just registering, obviously you're all attending as well, but you're going to get a follow-up email. The follow-up email is going to include for you a link to the on-demand recording. So you'll get this presentation in its entirety with all the Q&A and everything like that. So just wait for that. It's going to be sent to you automatically from PeerRef, the platform that we're on, within 24 hours. The other aspect that we're going to have included in that follow-up email is a link to a certificate of completion. So there will be a certificate of completion in there that's available as is. You can simply click on that, get that certificate in PDF format if that's something of value to you. So just be sure to wait about 24 hours. You should get that follow-up email. If for some reason you cannot, then you can simply reach out to us at the contact list that you see on the PeerRef platform. Other than that, I think we still got a few people streaming in. We're up to 350 now. But if you are having any trouble, just remember to back out, just refresh this PeerRef page. If you're having any audio issues, video issues, anything like that, it's a stream. So if you usually refresh, you should be able to deal with any issues. All right. And I think that's it. So I'll bring in our host right now.
Hi, Clark, and everybody else. Thank you for joining us today. I do want to do a quick audio check since we do seem to be having a little bit of issues. Can people hear me? If you can answer in the chat, just a few of you, that would be great. All right, it looks like some of you can hear me, so at least that's good. Like Clark said, if you are having audio issues, just try to refresh that page or just make sure that your audio is working within PeerRef. Check your browser, and then of course your standard computer audio as well. So my name is Dr. Accdon-LetPub. You can call me AV for short. I'm a research communications strategist here at LetPub. Before jumping into publishing, I do have an academic background. I focused in geology or the earth sciences. I got my master's at the University of New Hampshire, and then I went on to do my PhD at the University at Buffalo. I've been very lucky to work with a lot of international authors, both when I did my academic research and now in scholarly publishing. So it's great to have so many of you here with us today. I am not going to spend too much time on myself because if you have returned, you've probably heard it all before. So I do want to take this opportunity to announce our special guest today, which is Dr. Joe Licciardi, who's going to introduce himself right now with a little bit of both his academic background and his journal editor experience.
So hello, everybody, and thank you to AV and Clark for the opportunity to participate today in this webinar. So I'm Joe Licciardi. I am currently a department chair and professor in the Department of Earth Sciences at the University of New Hampshire. And I'm a geologist, so I study glaciers, volcanoes, climate change, and I work in places like Yellowstone, Iceland, Peru, Greenland. But I've also served as an editor for the Journal of Quaternary Science for the better part of 6 years. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to offer some perspectives from my my desk as an editor, and I also review a lot of papers as well, continuing to do that through the present day.
Oh, thank you, Joe. So for how this webinar is going to progress, I'm going to take it away here and give all of you some general information on today's topic, which is addressing reviewer comments after peer review. So we want you to be able to take the information that you learn, both from the PowerPoint presentation, but especially from Joe's candid answers, to make you have an easier submission time, increase your chances of journal acceptance for all of your research publications. So for the webinar today, I'm just going to start with some basics, review the peer review process, and then jump right into writing that response letter document, what type of revisions you may receive from the editors and reviewers, and then how to address those professionally and politely, but also comprehensively in your letter. We'll also touch on how you can address some of those difficult reviewer or editor comments that you might receive. And then we're going to spend a lot of time with Joe in an extensive Q&A. So if you did receive our email letting you know about this webinar, this is really your chance to directly communicate with a journal editor. Ask him questions that you've always wanted to know, what it's like to be behind the scenes, how you can increase your chances of acceptance. This is that opportunity, so feel free to ask whatever questions you like related to this topic. Again, as Clark said, please input your questions into the Q&A function. And if you see a question that you'd like an answer to yourself, all you have to do is upvote that question instead of writing that question again. Again, the questions that have the most votes at the end will be the ones we get to first. So just before we begin, I want to remind us where we all are when we think about the topic of this webinar. So in terms of the peer review process, you as an author will initially submit your manuscript for consideration of publication to whatever target journal that you are seeking. At the same time, you may have the opportunity to have a preprint of your manuscript posted. This can be done at the same time you submit your manuscript, but it can also be done separately. After you submit your manuscript, most likely through a submission system online, your manuscript's going to travel down the line to the journal office, which has a variety of different staff editors, and then also your academic editor. And academic editor is often called the handling editor, or more generally, the journal editor. And that's the position that our special guest, Joe, has experience in. In that journal office, those staff editors are going to do the initial check. Oftentimes, that's just a lot of formatting, ethics requirements, any sort of disclosures that are required. And if you pass all of those, you're going to go on to the academic editor, who's going to make that initial assessment or decision about whether or not to send your manuscript out for peer review or to reject it right away, which is often known as that desk rejection. In the case of this webinar, that academic editor is going to be sending your work out for peer review. A collection of peer reviewers are going to analyze your work, read and provide comments on your manuscript, and then return them back to that handling editor, at which point the editor is going to use the peer reviewer's feedback, as well as perhaps some of their own, and make a decision. And that's where we're here. That's where we're going to be at for this webinar today. So you're going to have that revision requested, and now what do you do? First and foremost, unless your manuscript is immediately accepted with no revisions, which is incredibly, incredibly rare, you are going to have to revise your manuscript. So that's very much normal. So the question is, what do you do first when you get that email? You should read it thoroughly. And in general, you're probably going to get an email. This might be directly to you or something that comes in within that submission system. It's going to tell you the decision type, so whether that's major, minor revisions, accept, or reject. And it's going to be followed by both the reviewer comments and then the editorial comments as well. Most importantly, one of the main things to look for is, of course, the deadline for resubmission. So that means the time at which you're supposed to have those revisions complete and your manuscript resubmitted to the journal along with that response to reviewers document. After you've read it thoroughly, noted that submission deadline, you're going to want to share that decision email as well as the comments you received with any co-authors that are on that manuscript. You're going to want to eventually discuss with them how you're going to be able to tackle those comments. And then you as a lead author, it's primarily your responsibility to kind of have the first go at doing the revisions. So the lead author does typically complete those revisions, write up that response to reviewers document, and then share that document with their co-authors. And you can seek guidance from others along the way. A typical response letter includes a summary paragraph at the top, something kind of similar in length to a cover letter or even shorter. And this is followed by point responses to the reviewer's comments. So what I mean by that is you'll take one individual comment by the reviewer, say out of their 10 comments, and then you'll put a response right below that. And you'll keep that cycle going until you're done with your response letter. It's also always important to remind the journal editor what manuscript they're working with. So it's good to put that manuscript title and ID in there as well. When you are revising your document, it's important to also keep track of all the changes that you make, because many journal editors or journals in general require that they see the revisions that you've done. So this is something that you want to check with the journal editor or with the journal guidelines for how they like to see those changes. Sometimes it's highlighting, other times it's just track changes, and sometimes they just want to see a nice, pristine, clean, and revised manuscript. So in terms of a checklist for what you should do when you get that response to reviewer's document, number one is you want to try to respond by the deadline given by the journal. And if you need more time, you can request an extension. You always need to provide an organized response to reviewer's document. And importantly, in that document, you need to address every single one of the reviewer comments. It is very important to not leave any comment unanswered. You, of course, want to be professional and polite in your responses. And if there's any other extras by the journal, sometimes there's post-acceptance revisions, different formatting that you need to do. You also want to pay attention to those little differences as well and make sure they're complete. And importantly, while revisions can be time-consuming, sometimes they're very difficult, it's important to remember that if you get a revise and resubmit decision, so major or minor revisions need to be done before acceptance, this does indicate that your manuscript has found a good home in terms of its journal. It's a good fit, and the editor wants to publish your work in that journal, but you just need to do a little bit of extra revisions first. So in terms of a question that we get a lot is what constitutes a major versus minor revision in terms of your manuscript? It's a little bit blurry and it does vary between journals. Maybe Joe can give us some insight on this later, but a major revision often indicates that while your topic is of interest, the editor did send it out for peer review after all, the editor or the reviewer might not be able to determine if the quality of the work is sufficient. This is going to result in you doing revisions, and it can also sometimes result in the journal editor sending the manuscript out for additional peer review, so another round of peer review. Minor revisions require a little bit less effort on your part, and most oftentimes you submit your response to reviewer's document, and the journal editor reviews it. He may send it to the peer reviewers to do a quick check. But a new round of peer review with new peer reviewers is usually not something that happens. One thing to note is that major versus minor is not a numbers game. Major revisions could only be a few comments and minor revisions could be a couple pages. So it's not associated with the number of comments. That is not the difference between major and minor. I do have a list here of some examples of what may constitute major versus minor revisions. Again, this is something that is journal specific, editor specific, and manuscript specific. I won't go through all of these. Again, you guys will receive this presentation afterwards, so you can look at this again. But again, minor revisions might just be fixing a few typos here and there. The formatting wasn't quite correct, or maybe your figure numbers were a little bit disorganized. Major revisions is something more like there was a large section missing regarding your methods. The writing is too unclear for the peer reviewers to understand the novelty or the contributions of your work. You may have to redo statistical analyses or rewrite parts of your paper. Those all are something that would be more major revisions, more time consuming. So now let's jump into some tips for how to write this response letter, some best practices. So of course, eventually you are going to have to start your response letter. And I usually recommend doing this maybe 24 hours or so after you get that initial email. Sometimes in seeing that you have a lot of work to do can be super overwhelming. It can be even a little bit emotional. Let that kind of dust settle and then start your response letter with a clear head, perhaps the next day. What I like to do is simply copy and paste the comments that I receive from the editor and reviewer into a word processing document. I answer some of the quick, easy ones first. And then as a student, I would always meet with my advisors or my committee members and discuss the manuscript decision, the comments that I received, and what I think is the best way to go about responding. One way to do this is to divide the comments that you received into different categories. Number one being those really easy, quick fixes. Perhaps the reviewer told you exactly what word to use instead of the one that you originally did. Those are quite simple. Adding line numbers to your manuscript, again, very quick and easy. The second section would be items that need a little bit more time. So these are going to be rewriting sections, maybe doing more experiments, something that's time consuming on your part, something that you can't just do right then and there. And then category 3, which may or may not be pertinent to you, is that you want to find those requests that you don't quite understand, ones that you're not sure you can address, or perhaps you're not sure what the reviewer is looking for. At that point, if you do have co-authors on your manuscript, you're going to want to assign tasks to them. While you are the sole person as the lead author to put everything together in the end, the tasks can be spread out to your co-authors to, number one, get things done faster. But if certain individuals had very specific contributions, they have the best expertise in that part of the manuscript, so they can help you with those certain revisions. Importantly, we are, in order to resubmit your manuscript on time, you need to provide deadlines for your colleagues, and that's something that is strongly encouraged. Everybody is super, super busy, and putting a deadline in is going to be very important for you to stay on track. In terms of deadlines, once you've talked to your co-authors, you've decided how much time you might need to complete this, you need to identify if you need a revision extension. And most journals, if not all, think that it's okay for you to ask for an extension. What they don't like is for you to ask for an extension right before the resubmission date or on the submission date, or just submit your revisions late. So again, it's 100% okay to ask for an extension, but do so very early on, very quickly after you've received those comments. Furthermore, if there are some of those category 3 responses, those ones where the comment or queries were unclear, it is also okay to ask the journal for clarification. Examples of this might be when a reviewer or 1 or 2 reviewers have opposite suggestions for the same component of your manuscript, so you don't know which one is best. In those cases, you yourself can choose which one is most suitable and then explain why as part of your response letter. Or you can kind of look to see if the journal editor left any comments that might sway you in one direction versus the other. Or you can simply reach out and ask for the journal editor's advice, as well as your colleagues, of course. I'll leave you here with some 3 golden rules to think about when responding to reviewer comments. So again, these 3 points that I make here are something that you can use throughout your whole entire response document. First and foremost, you always want to answer the comments completely. It is your responsibility to respond to each and every single query raised by the editors or the reviewers. If you don't respond to all of them, it kind of gives the journal editor the impression that you're not taking this necessarily seriously. You just want to do this you want to do it fast and be done. And again, a journal is going to pride themselves on the research that they publish. So they do want this to be thorough and comprehensive. You also want to be professional. You want to be polite. While sometimes a reviewer comment can be very difficult, it can be a little jarring perhaps, and even rude and sometimes inappropriate, it's very important to not criticize the reviewer's comments. Sometimes you have to swallow your pride a little bit and just answer as politely and professionally as possible. You also want to answer each reviewer comment with evidence. And what I mean by that is supporting your explanations, justifying them. So a good example of this is in the example of a disagreement. You do not believe, you don't agree with what the reviewer suggests you should do with your manuscript. And it is okay to not complete every revision that you have. That is okay, but it's only okay if you provide a coherent, understandable argument that's supported by evidence. You can use citations from the literature to back up your decision. You need to clearly state the reasons for why you do not want to make those revisions. And importantly, you can't simply say something like, we disagree, or we will not make those changes. You need to explain why and provide justification. If you do this, this is something that the journal editor may return your manuscript to you and have you work on until it's complete. So for the last part of my presentation here, I want to go over some potential difficult reviewers or editor issues that you may encounter as an author. So again, if there's anything that you've had a question about that I've reviewed so far, throw those questions right into the Q&A because we're coming up on that opportunity where you get to ask Joe any questions about peer review and the review process. So from here, I want to talk about what it's like from the author's perspective when you get some difficult comments, but then also what it's like from the editor's perspective. So you as an author, if you were to jump into the editor's shoes and read your own responses, and if they're a little bit off-putting or not so great, what you can do to kind of avoid having the editor become disgruntled with your own response letter. So first and foremost, what it's like from your perspective. If you as an author receive comments from the reviewer or editor and they're vague, you don't understand what they are, something that you can do is simply, again, ask for clarification, but do so very politely. A lot of times a reviewer wants you to add in a lot of different analyses, add in a lot more discussion, but sometimes that causes your paper to go over the word count or to not align with journal guidelines, and that can be very difficult from the author's perspective. Ways to get around that are to create an appendix or perhaps a supplemental section to your paper, and you can also contact the journal editor and see if there can be, if a longer paper can be accommodated by the journal in this case to respond to the reviewers. Again, opposing reviewer comments is another common issue that an author encounters. What I said before, you can check the editor's comments, see which way the reviewer or the editor is leaning, and you can go in that direction as long as you yourself agree that that is the most suitable answer. And then sometimes you will receive reviewer requests that are simply not true or they're not possible, perhaps doing a significant number of additional experiments. And this is where you need to just be very polite in your response. Say that you cannot complete those for X, Y, and Z of your answer. And again, be polite. In general, most reviewers will understand. Oftentimes, when they ask you to do additional experiments, it may simply be giving you ideas for future work that you can build on. So they are, in a way, assisting you, helping you with your research. Now, if we jump to the editor's perspective, when they receive your response to reviewer's document, these are the things that they may encounter that can be a little bit difficult from their perspective. So if you don't organize your document, your responses might be really disorganized. They can't follow what you did. It's unclear to see the changes that you made. So in order to not make the editor grumpy, what you should do is spend some time organizing your document. Make sure that the manuscript page and line numbers match between the review document and your manuscript. You can use some sort of simple formatting to make it clear what's a reviewer question and what's your answer. One common issue that journal editors see is that us as authors, we thank the reviewer for every single comment that they make. And this is really very, very unnecessary. If you say thank you right at the beginning of your response document in that summary paragraph, that'll be enough. They'll understand that you're thanking them as long as you're polite and professional throughout. I won't go through all of these because again, you are going to get this slide. But again, if you just do not want to be rude or insulting to any of the reviewers, you need to be diplomatic and tactful. You want to be concise in your explanations. And the last one here is also important. While you spend all the time in the world putting together your manuscript, making sure there's no spelling errors, the grammar is good, the English is well written, you do also want to do the same thing for your response letter. If a journal editor receives a response letter that's poorly written, again, very unclear statements, it's not, he or she is not sure what you're trying to say, how you're responding, it's going to give a bad impression. It's going to look like you put your response letter together in only a few minutes, that you're not taking the submission seriously. So again, you want to proofread your response letter as well as your resubmitted manuscript. So that is where I'm going to leave you today. So we are going to jump into the Q&A. Again, I wanted to only provide a few slides for you so that we can have a really great discussion with our guest, Joe Licciardi, who is going to give us that behind the scenes view into being a journal editor. So while we bring everyone back online, I do just want to give a plug that we will be continuing the LetPub webinar series next month. So just keep an eye out for an email for that.
Excellent. Okay, good setup. So we can get right in, and Joe, and you can maybe field some of these questions. I imagine some of them are going to be quite difficult based on what you indicated in your presentation, AV, and what we know about the process ourselves. There's some tricky things to navigate, which is why it's good to have Joe here to, I think, give a candid opinion. So to start off with, I'm actually going to do, I'll save this one. Let's start with sort of conflicting, this is going to be a common theme, and I think there's actually going to be several examples of it, but conflicting reviewer opinions. So in this situation, you have a reviewer 1 saying the introduction is short and need to bring more reference studies. Reviewer 3 saying the introductory section includes a variety of things: introduction, network and social support, personal style, and social support. Although the introduction is well written and adequately structured, authors should reduce length. So you're wondering, how do you address both reviewers in this situation, which it might involve the editor? One thinks it's too short, one thinks it's too long. What sort of step do you take as an author? I'm presuming the editor didn't chime in and handle this. So
yeah, sure. So that's a really good question, and I could even maybe expand on some examples of where you have conflicting advice from reviewers from the editor's perspective. Sometimes I would get reviews back ranging from minor revision, this paper is fabulous as is, just a few tweaks, and then same paper, different reviewer saying this paper should be rejected. So there's some broad divergence in the opinions, the overall opinions of reviewers. And it's really the editor's job to sort through that and make judgment, particularly if they are in the field of study that the paper is about. They should be able to sort through what's reasonable and what's not in terms of requests. And if the editor themselves is not in that field of study, we tend to have advisory boards that we can reach out to a relevant expert. In the finer details and examples that are in the chat of specific comments saying, well, the introduction should be too long or too short, or it's too short, etc. Again, I think it's really the editor's job to sort through what seems to be the most reasonable advice to improve the manuscript, because the whole goal of the review process is to address feedback to make the paper stronger so that it will have a bigger impact in the literature and will be a more useful contribution to the community. So as an author, when you get conflicting advice, I think you would definitely want to respond with what you think is best for your paper. But again, I think it's really it's okay to reach out to the editor and ask for their opinion on how you should respond most appropriately, because they're ultimately making the decision on whether to move your paper forward or not.
I have a little bit of a kind of an extension question to that. So you did use the example where one reviewer thought the paper was great, accepted minor revisions, and then the other reviewer was reject the paper. So if it's the editor's job and you say you have those two responses, what is it in the manuscript that makes you decide to reject or accept that paper? What do you do?
Well, I guess I can back up a little bit and generally say that if there's a wide range of opinions on a paper by reviewers who are presumably experts in the topic, that's a trigger for me to send it out for another review, perhaps to another round of reviewers. And I think that would be one of the most common ways as an editor to address what would be a very broad range of opinions. It is a bit of a warning sign or a bit of a red flag if you have that wide of a range of opinions on a paper, unless you can see through one of the reviews as being unreasonable or unfair, or based on misinformation or misunderstanding of the paper. If there's a consensus among the reviewers, they all have a sort of a similar view or feeling of how the paper can be improved, then it generally doesn't need to get sent back out, because you have the information you need already as an editor to make a decision. I'm not sure if that answers the specific question. I may have gone off on a tangent, but it can be very difficult to address conflicting feedback from reviewers. And again, I think it's really the editor's job to help authors sort through those types of issues.
Yeah, I like the last point, and I think it's something for this audience to remind, because we get this a lot of times. We also get this with clients on the LetPub side and everything, where sometimes people, there's an assumption of excellence among, reviewers and certainly journal editors, right? The journal editor is like the person deciding if paper gets in. And so there's this sort of, maybe put them up on a pedestal, but not everybody's doing an equal job. Sometimes people are just having a bad day, that type of thing. And so sometimes it's something that's not really your fault, and you need to sort of pursue the person who is responsible for that to make a judgment, give an answer. So don't always just assume everything's going to go the way it's supposed to. Everybody's going to do everything exactly. And sometimes you have to reach out. Don't feel like you're doing something out of the ordinary, because they might be doing something that's not quite up to standard, and that's where it's leaving a gap. And you'll just be at a loss if you're not thinking about, oh, I should ask them directly. If you're hesitant to do those things, I think you'll find yourself in sort of despondent positions like that quite often. Okay, let's move on to a lot of these will be quite similar into this topic. So this one's concerning when there's like requests for additional data. I'm suspecting it's a situation where, if it's experimental, that you're asking for more experiments to be included for the collection of said data. So sometimes you have reviewers who are asking for this, and you don't feel the authors don't feel it's relevant to the study. You explain it to the reviewer of why you don't think that's appropriate to be pursuing as an avenue, and the reviewers say they kind of still want it. Again, what's the best approach in these situations? And I suspect the editor plays, again, a big role in that.
Yeah, sure. So that would be an issue that I encountered many times during my 6 years as an editor. And it was often a difficult issue to address, because the authors would typically have a vision of what they want their paper to accomplish and the message that they want to get across. And they wouldn't have submitted the paper if they didn't think that story was strong enough to be published. But if reviewers point out in their feedback that there are more analyses that need to be done before the results can strongly support their conclusions, or in many cases, reviewers would say, you simply don't have enough data and you should run more, you should take more measurements. Some of those requests are simply not possible for authors to follow through on, because there are limitations in time and particularly funding to ask an author to generate more data often requires funding that they do not have in place anymore. So I don't think it's necessarily a fair request to tell authors that they need to invest more funds and or workload into their paper that doesn't exist anymore. On the other hand, if again, it's going to be part of the editor's job to decide and make a judgment as to whether it's truly important for those data or additional analyses to be included in order for the paper to be up to the standard that's required for it to be published and to pass the peer review process successfully. And unfortunately, in some cases, I made decisions where it seemed to be the case that the data they were just too thin to support the story, and we couldn't publish the paper in its form. It is sometimes perhaps a symptom of the project design itself, that maybe more data needed to be gathered before the authors put together their manuscript for submission. And there is such pressure to publish that there is temptation to submit smaller data sets piecemeal to get more papers, but sometimes that backfires if you don't have strong enough story. On the other hand, if it's something along the lines of more statistical analyses or data analyses of data that are already in hand, I think that's a more reasonable request, and that could usually be done with more investment of time, but not necessarily people resources and funding. It's a very tricky situation though, and ultimately whether a paper passes peer review is going to depend on whether the science is sound and whether the data and the results support the interpretations and the conclusions. That's the most important thing, I would say.
Excellent. Anything to follow up, Baby?
Yeah, I was gonna say, do you have any advice on how the author should respond? Say it's an issue of gathering more data, something that's a little bit more, quote, out of the scope of the revision process. What is an appropriate response that some authors could use that as an editor you would find justified?
Well, so I would get responses and sometimes pushback from authors that would clearly explain to me that they do not have the resources to run more measurements, or that their student is no longer with them anymore, and so that there's no one to continue that work. But in some cases, these papers could be, I don't want to use the word salvaged, but like you could focus on maybe one narrower aspect of the story that is solid, and then frame your paper more around that. So in other words, if you have enough data to support one set of your conclusions, maybe that's the answer to move that paper forward, is to make it a strong paper on those conclusions, but maybe let go of some of the ones that are a little bit more speculative or not as strongly supported by the evidence you have in hand.
Excellent. Yeah, nice point. I was actually very curious about this because when I've been helping authors, like you say, sometimes you just don't have the resources, and it is a consideration, but sometimes it's a consideration that needs to be juxtaposed against a scientific rationale, because you can't. Sometimes I think I've seen authors who get in a situation where they're, oh, like, sorry, no money type situation, which is, it's acceptable, but it has to be a bit formulaic, I think, in how they approach it sometimes. An issue of, as you mentioned very specifically, have we decided that your conclusions are novel and impactful? If we have, and if the work without the additional requests is enough to support that, then you can say, well, this would strengthen it, but that's really outside the scope. We don't really have the resources to tackle that and add it to this paper type thing, is usually the route I go. And so, yeah, it's very, very tricky, but I think if you figure out, you've laid out very clearly the scenarios, and the author can figure out which scenario they fall into and then sort of go in that direction. Or if you're in a situation where it's simply your conclusions, what you just mentioned, I think is crucial. Maybe you have some multiple conclusions, and maybe you let go of something that's not well supported in order to say, But then you also have to justify with that conclusion lost, is the work still impactful and novel enough for publication in this type of journal? So it's a little bit of a give and take, but as long as you can sort of, that's the crux. If you can demonstrate it and it's extra or strength that it whatnot, you sort of use that as like your linchpin to revolve around in your arguments as an author. So very tricky, but yeah, I was very, very interested to hear your response because I was quite curious. Moving on a little bit. Oh, sorry.
I can just add to that, Clark. Sorry, one more thing that Avi brought up earlier, which is that when you get that type of feedback where a reviewer is saying you need more data for your story, the positive aspect of that is that you're often being given ideas for how you could extend your research and how that might lead to new research avenues. So there is a positive spin in some cases to those types of feedback comments.
Yeah, we actually did have a comment by somebody in the chat who said that adding more data, if requested by the reviewers and you can't do it, but your paper is still going to be published, you can put that as part of the limitations section in your discussion. And then Joe, as you said, put a spin on it that that's what you're going to tackle in your future research. So again, the reviewers, even though they might be rude occasionally, they are assisting you in your research.
Nice. And then I actually have a couple questions. So I have a highly upvoted question that ties into a bunch of others, and it's related to request for additional references or citations. And sometimes the way these requests go, either implied or explicit, I think you already know the direction, but let's go with this one that's most upvoted. So a reviewer or even an editor is asking for, I'd like you to tackle the multiple situations, and so I'll give them to you. One is specifically asking for certain papers that are theirs or their own. The editor perhaps asking for papers specifically from that journal itself. And then third, maybe the more dubious situation of asking for these specific references with a common name throughout them, saying like these are in the field or something like that. There's obviously varying levels. So maybe I think, what's your opinion on each of these levels? And then how do you maybe deal with some of these scenarios?
Well, that's come up a lot, and I can say off the bat, I don't have a very high opinion if the entire review is all about a reviewer saying that the authors need to cite more of their specific body of work. Now, that's fine if those papers are relevant and that they were truly, they should not have been omitted. If they are truly important and relevant to the manuscript, then of course those papers should be cited. And that's, if the authors are amenable to that, that is an easy comment to deal with. But then again, I don't think that as an author you would be obligated to, just because you're getting this comment from a reviewer, to add long lists of citations to someone else's work when some of it might not be relevant. So you have to make the judgment call yourself. In the journal that I worked for, I never encountered the issue of other editors trying to sort of steer authors to cite papers from that journal, but I suppose that's occurs at other journals, but that is not in my experience as an editor. But overall, I think when a review is framed very narrowly around one specific research group's work and doesn't have the breadth of feedback that takes in other information from other researchers, then that's a red flag to me as an editor. And I tend to see that those reviewers as potentially having an agenda. And again, it's the editor's job to make a judgment on which reviewers are making the most reasonable and constructive comments and which of them are not. But it's certainly fine and common and often appropriate to add references that the authors simply didn't catch. The literature is so expansive, it's almost impossible to keep track of every single relevant paper. So it could be a good comment from reviewers to inform the authors of work they didn't maybe know about.
Nice. So in terms of replying to them, there's perhaps in situations where it could be viewed as pretty explicit, I'm not sure unethical, but that approach is not really appropriate to the peer review process, you perhaps go to the editor and say, you know, look, I respect like these types of requests, and I probably will add some of these, but I'm not, I think it's pretty clear that this is a little bit of a red flag. Can you just be aware of that when I give my replies, and maybe if necessary, if they're coming back, oh, you didn't do all the ones I wanted, whatnot, the editor can prep if it seems to be this explicit thing where it's just, hey, cite all my papers, something inappropriate that the editor probably should have addressed before it went to you, but you can reach back out to them. Another thing that I usually do if I think it's something maybe in the softer area where you're saying like, this kind of seems like they're just digging for citations. Maybe you're not obligated to do all of the ones they list or anything, and you just pick ones that are appropriate. And then in your response, something like, you know, I've included this one and this one where appropriate, and you just ignore the other ones and don't feel obligated to just tag these on. So just because I think people are wondering, like, how do I respond to that? Like, how do I give an answer in the actual the response letter? It's difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. In your response letter to the editor, I think it's always going to be a good idea to be clear as to why you are choosing to include some of those suggested citations, and why you don't feel it's appropriate or necessary to include necessarily all of the ones mentioned or listed by a reviewer. And that's just the general theme. Again, that's one of the points that Avi made earlier. In your response letter, you should be very clear about the rationale behind why you are responding the way you're responding.
And then we have another one that's fairly upvoted. Why does my paper go through 2 rounds of major revision, even after it seems like perhaps in the first round, the reviewers are fairly satisfied? I'm wondering, perhaps there you have a situation where maybe the editor themselves, who ultimately does have the decision, isn't as happy as the reviewers. And or sometimes, again, this miscommunication where what's sort of implied when you go through it doesn't jive with the outcome that you feel that would be appropriate. Could you maybe give any insight from your experience of getting reviews like this?
Absolutely. So there's a couple of reasons why that might happen. So one reason could be that if the editor makes the decision that they invite a resubmission, but after major revisions, and then the revision comes in and the authors have simply not adequately addressed those reviewer comments in the judgment of the editor, then they haven't done major revisions. They may have returned it with only slight revisions and therefore didn't satisfy the comments of the reviewers and what the editor thinks needs to be done. Another way that this sometimes would happen is if I would get a paper and based on the reviews, I'd send the authors back an invitation, accepted, but potentially accepted after major revisions. We always have to qualify that when we invite a resubmission, that never guarantees that we're going to actually publish it. The authors have to follow through with their responses appropriately. In some cases, I would send out a paper that had various issues with it to a different set of second reviewers. And those different reviewers would sometimes pick up on issues in the paper that the first round of reviewers did not. And I know that that can be incredibly frustrating as an author to get yet another decision from the editor saying, well, your paper still needs major revisions. Hopefully the editor explains clearly why that is the case so that it's not, so that as an author, you know how to respond to that type of decision letter. But it could be that different reviewers saw your manuscript and saw different issues with it, and the editor thought those were valid. So those two situations would happen quite a bit while I was an editor. And I don't know if this comes up in the Q&A in other questions, but again, there is no guarantee, or there should not be a guarantee of acceptance. It shouldn't be the case that you think you can just keep resubmitting your manuscript and it will eventually get to the point where it's publishable. That doesn't always happen. And that's really, it's unfortunate when that happens, but in some cases, we just haven't been able to accept a paper because in our view, the reviewer comments were just simply not addressed adequately.
Excellent. We'll move right on then. This is a good one, I think, well upvoted. So it's mentioned that authors should avoid overly long author explanations. Any suggestions on balancing and what you maybe view? I'm sure it's maybe sometimes field specific, but what's long and what's too long? Because you can see some response letters that come back, not really related to the number of comments, but just, I mean, it can be pages and pages. Do you have preferences for how things are included in the response letter, like verbatim from the manuscript, reference, making sure figures or anything that are being referenced are out? What's ways to make it so that reviewers and editors can navigate the response letter? Because that's, I think, what you get into sometimes. It's unnavigable for a lot of them. So what's good? What's the balance between short and long?
That's a great question. It's a hard one to answer because it probably is journal specific and field specific. From my perspective, I always appreciated response letters that were well organized and concise. I think one of the suggestions that Avi had when she would get comments back from some of her manuscripts, to just copy and paste and categorize the types of critiques that you got on your manuscript. And if you do that, and then right below those, you basically address those points directly so that the editor and potentially the reviewers who might see your response letter or responses to their comments anyways, they'll be able to very quickly navigate and see exactly how you addressed each one of those comments. I certainly did occasionally get response letters that were longer than the manuscript itself. And I don't think that as an author, you're doing yourself any favors by drafting a very long response letter that is, likely gonna probably be on the editor's desk for a lot longer than a short, concise one. So if you're interested in having a fast turnaround on your manuscript, clear and concise is the way to go. That would be my recommendation.
Okay.
Sometimes,
oh, sorry, go ahead, Avi.
Okay. Well, I had a separate question, which is from the author's perspective, after you submit your revisions back, how often does the journal editor send it to the reviewers to check? Is there sometimes when the journal editor just reads the responses that the authors give and you don't send it to the peer reviewers? What's the balance for that? What makes you decide to send it back to the reviewers or just keep it for yourself?
Well, there's a lot of factors in what how to decide how you want forward with that. Generally speaking, if the feedback from the reviewers was basically on the level of minor, maybe even minor to moderate revisions, if you're an editor and you're doing your job, you should be able to, at that point, handle it yourself, which is in everyone's best interest because it's going to be a quicker turnaround for the authors. And I don't want to say that it's lazy, but it kind of is if you just don't even look at that and you just send it right back to the reviewers and basically let them do the work that you're supposed to be doing as an editor, which is to make the judgment on whether those minor revisions are adequate. Generally speaking, I wouldn't send a paper out again if I thought that the authors addressed the feedback appropriately and there maybe were some minor things, editorial, language issues, or just a few arguments that might be strengthened to bring it up to snuff. I would send a paper back out. I generally would send a paper back out if the feedback was major revisions and some of those specific issues that were brought up by the reviewers were either outside my expertise or that the reviewers had a particular perspective on that I know would be valuable to see how their assessment of how the authors responded to their specific points within their wheelhouse. I would sometimes send papers back to, I would ask first the reviewers, are you okay with seeing this paper again? And more often than not, they would actually be eager to see how the authors responded to their responses, in which case I would happily send it back to them. In some cases, reviewers would be like, I'm super busy, I can't see this paper again. In that case, I would send it out to a different reviewer. But I often found it to be really constructive and ultimately a benefit to the authors if the original reviewers saw responses again, and more often than not, the reviewers would be pretty happy to see that the authors were thoughtfully addressing their comments. And it would make the paper stronger in the end.
Oh, that's all great. Thank you.
Okay. The next one here, and I think this will be relevant from an editor's point of view, but really this could be for both of you. And maybe you're probably going to think about it in geology terms, but and when you're trying to argue the originality, in this case, a method, right, is specifically mentioned. So what are you looking for as a characteristic of a quote unquote new technique or method that demonstrates that it's original enough from, obviously it's probably iterative, we're building on something else. So what would demonstrate when you're trying to argue that something's new enough or doing something better, what aspects of it or characteristics stand out to you as qualifying as novel?
That is a really, really great question. And that's also very relevant to writing proposals as much as it is papers. So it's a really great topic to think about more. So at least, and Avi can maybe take over and chime in here, but from my perspective, it can be really exciting to read about a new or novel technique that is basically allowing researchers to conduct a better analysis, or maybe it cuts the time down and the results are, developed with more confidence. That's always really exciting. But I think that the novelty of a new technique also always has to be balanced against its practicality. And what I mean by that is I've sometimes seen methods papers that are advancing a new technique for how to do some measurement or analysis. And as a result, they cut down on the uncertainties and there's some improvement. But in order to achieve that, sometimes modest improvement requires a gargantuan effort in terms of time and funding to achieve that result. So in other words, if you have a new technique that you'd like to promote in the community, but no one's going to have the resources to actually use it, then it's not really as useful to the community. So I think that that's a balance. And again, this is a comment on both manuscripts as well as proposals. So practicality, I think, is really important. Is it feasible for researchers to actually adopt your method and improve their techniques? Or are you basically writing a methods paper saying that only our lab can do this and isn't this great? that type of novel method development is not as impactful to the community.
Yeah, I have to absolutely agree. The applicability of the technique that you have is pretty critical. And maybe that's something that the reviewer was asking. If they want you to explain the originality of the technique that you're proposing or the method that you're proposing, maybe you can bolster that with how that technique can be applied in not only your field, but maybe some adjacent fields of research. That can kind of bring out the novelty a little bit more. And that is, I think, something in general that journal editors look for, and same thing with proposals, Joe, just like you said, the broader impacts of the research that you're doing, those should be very, very clearly stated. It is also possible that if, on the other hand, the reviewer said, I don't find this as original, it's not something new, perhaps there's something in the literature that you as an author missed. I mean, it is possible. There are many, many researchers out there. And if you're tackling a topic that's, a hot topic in your research field, there might be a few different groups trying to, move that field forward with similar techniques or methods. So again, maybe it is worth your time to, delve into the literature again, make sure you didn't miss anything. And then if you didn't, then I would say build on that practicality or applicability aspects of that technique you're putting forward.
Excellent. Yeah, so it sounds like bottom line from you guys is quite often that it's not that not necessarily that the technique is doing a better job at what it's measuring, but quite often you want to be juxtaposing it against its practicality or applicability. So people are actually going to collect more data, right? So like if you have something new that works better in the field, even though it may be measuring the same thing, that is going to be how you need to frame it as a technique or method being novel or better or original, that type of thing. In physiology and some of the life sciences, there also are where technique you're trying to improve objectively the measurement, because stuff can be quite hard to measure, and people don't really like surrogate measurements anymore. We're always getting better and better. So it might start off as you're measuring volume as a surrogate for blood flow, and then they're like, well, that doesn't work. There's something better. And then you're measuring it at a large artery, and you say, well, then you don't know what's going on downstream, so you're not actually measuring it at the tissue. Then you try to measure at the tissue. So you can improve. You can either be arguing at an improvement in measurement, of the accuracy of what you're measuring, more specifically what you're measuring, or again, just that the technique's better, lower cost, less resources, more likely to be utilized when you're trying to collect large scale data. So yeah, any of those ways are a great way to frame it, because that's the bottom line question. Like, how do I convince them, right? Like, how do I prove this? And you got to pick what you think it is, and then stress that that's the originality and that's what you're improving upon. Okay. And then this question is about plagiarism, because as we know, AV, we do a lot of plagiarism checks, and we use the Authenticate, which journals quite often use, but we already know the problems with Authenticate. It's pretty objective. You can see where you're going to have issues that are flagged that are not really issues, and ultimately then it goes to someone else to sort of determine if they view that as plagiarism when it's on the borderline. Authenticate is just used as a rough check. So from your perspective, Joe, when you take a look at it and you're sort of like, oh, am I supposed to consider this plagiarism or not? What do you really view? How do you interpret any sort of plagiarism?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think that's probably a better question for you and AV. But one of the issues that this is, I think, relevant that I would see a lot is from authors who are highly productive, and they're publishing a lot of papers on maybe a theme or some similar line of inquiry or topic. And I can tell, it's sort of easy to tell by looking at if you're familiar with their previous papers or received them as manuscripts earlier, if they're basically taking the same introductory paragraph or large sections of previous papers and they appear in their new papers. And that is also a form of, well, it's self-plagiarism, I guess, but that's also something that journals are going to frown upon. It's a little different, I suppose, than plagiarizing someone else's work. You're basically recycling. And I would, if I saw that as an editor and it was obvious, I would encourage the authors in the most polite and professional of terms that we've seen these discussion blocks before, and that at the very least, they might want to vary their wording or maybe just cite a previous paper so they don't have to repeat all of that. I didn't really encounter many issues as an editor. There were other aspects of our editorial office that really handled the plagiarism issue. But if there were things that were obvious, that I picked up on, I would certainly have to call the authors out on it. And again, very professionally explain to them that it wasn't acceptable.
So for you, AV, then, so we have an author who has a paper. They've tried to take the flagged areas from Authenticate and fix them, change them as much as possible to not arbitrarily, just to not to get that similarity to come up, and they're left on a borderline. What should they be still worried about, and what should they just be like, okay, I can trust that this is going to go through and not by a person, be viewed as plagiarism?
I think it's a really hard topic, and I think it's also very field dependent too, because if you're in engineering and you're recycling the phrase of a model over and over and over again, your similarity is going to go up, especially between the different papers that you have. I think in the context of our webinar today, explaining that to the journal editor is something that's definitely okay to do. You should be able to explain that you have done the work to try to decrease the similarity. You saw the report, you're working with this, but in order for you to be clear in your writing, you do need to use these certain phrases because they're common phrases in the field. They're going to make your research discoverable. But as Joe said, you do need to do slight rewording of things. Again, I think, in my opinion, the methods section is something that if you're rewriting a paper or a couple of papers and it's using the same techniques, the methods section is where you run into self-plagiarism issues all over it. Because the first time you wrote it really well, and now you think you can't ever say it any better than that in your second and your third papers. But it is very important that you do some wordsmithing, just small word changes, a little bit of sentence organization, or reorganization, that'll really help you avoid any claims of self-plagiarism between your papers or your research group's papers. I don't know, Joe, do you have anything else to say on that? Or Clark, you as well?
No, not really. I mean, I was also thinking of the method sections as being particularly vulnerable to self-plagiarism because, again, if you're using a traditional and tried and true method or technique, there's sometimes really no better way of saying it than how you said it in the first paper you wrote about it. But in cases like that, you could just, I find myself with my own papers, the method sections are getting progressively more and more concise because I have the ability to cite previous papers where it's explained in more detail. And that's one way of getting around the self-plagiarism issue.
Yeah, absolutely. That's all I would say. That's my number one is when I look at it, I'm not thinking about the paper overall. I'm thinking about the sections. And so I say, okay, methods and results, because the results too, we don't like, and those are rules, right? The way we say like significantly different, like those exact terms and statements are required because we want uniformity. And so plagiarism checks on those seem like ludicrous to me, but we still do it and just like trust the software. But yeah, methods, results, I think as an author, if you're having trouble there, it's probably okay. You don't kill yourself. If you know, focus on if you're seeing these check red flags coming up in your introduction discussion, that's where you got to worry. That's where it might be problematic when it actually gets to a person of the journal and they're going to decide to reject it or not. But even there, it's tricky too. And so I think sometimes you have to just stick to your guns. And if you're getting a score that you don't like, you need to just be willing to pursue the journal and say like, no, you actually got to look and like I've checked this, like it's not plagiarized, because you're going to get the same thing. There's only so many. Changing a classical statement in a field that's that way because it's the perfect way to say it just for the sake of being different is kind of silly. Like you don't want to make your writing worse because like there's the perfect way to say it and you're just changing because you're worried about plagiarism. That's a bit silly. So yeah, you can change little things, and in particular I think not stringing things together. When people see statements that are flagged adjacent to each other, then it becomes an issue of like, okay, well, are you just grabbing these classical statements and then rehashing them here? And even that, like so much, maybe you could, even if it's not plagiarism, it's just maybe lazy writing, right? Then you're just, that's what you see students do quite often. They go, oh, all these statements that I hear, right, over and over and over, I'll just string those together to start my introduction, and they rely on that. So yeah, focus on intro discussion. It tends to be where you're going to have actual problems when someone at the journal, a person looks at it and says, okay, is the authenticate check accurate? Do I need to be concerned about this? And I think you're good to go from there. Okay, we have a lot, but let's try to get some quick ones we can go through. Let me see if I can put some of these together.
I can fill in the gap here with a question for you, Joe.
Sure.
All right,
yeah,
it's still the time from Clark. I guess, what are the most common revisions that are requested by reviewers, do you think, in general? Something that maybe authors can anticipate beforehand and then address before they even go out for peer review? Are there any standout comments from reviewers?
You mean in terms of the recurring types of feedback that I would tend to see in reviews?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, as we talked about earlier, I think one of the most common things you'll see in a review is like is to cite additional papers, for better or worse. But sometimes those are very helpful feedback for the authors to get. They might not be aware of relevant work. I think it's also it's very common for reviewers to ask authors to explain their interpretations, the support for their interpretations more clearly. And I think that comment is common for papers in which authors are, they're so familiar with their own data that maybe the interpretations that follow from them, they feel that they're obvious, but they don't take the time to explain it more clearly to people outside of their research bubble or their research group. I would see that a lot. And that's a very easy trap to fall into if you're writing your paper and you've been thinking about these data for so long. You think that what they mean is obvious to other people. So that's a really common comment. And then if it's there are a lot of editorial issues that reviewers tend to pick up on, even though it's shouldn't be their main focus, but it's going to be pretty obvious and perhaps irritating if they're dealing with a paper that's like, has typos and things that really should have been resolved before the manuscript got submitted, or language issues and things that haven't been dealt with before the manuscript gets submitted. It's kind of a hard question to answer because there are so many different comments, but those are some of the really common categories I would see.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm sure all those are applicable to a variety of different fields. But anyways, Clark, I know you have a few more questions to ask Joe.
Yeah, I don't want to keep us here too long, so I'm going to try to wrap these up a little bit, but we can hopefully get through some of these simpler ones here now. So you have a question here about in the revised paper or the response letter, sometimes you might have issues where you're trying to reference data from a different study or something in a citation or something like that to support your response. So how do you go about labeling? How careful do you need to be about that when you're referencing material not from the paper in your response letter?
That's an interesting question. I'm not exactly sure how to answer that, but if the data that you're bringing up in your response letter is published, then naturally one way of going about that is to bring it into your papers, to simply cite that study, be a little bit more clear in your manuscript about why those data are relevant. If the question is about unpublished data or emerging data that, I sometimes will see this in author response letters, we're about to publish all of this data and it supports what we're saying in this paper. Well, that's not something you can generally do. So you need to get that other paper out so it's a citable document and not ask the editor and the reviewers to take your word for it that this next paper you're working on is going to answer all those questions.
Dangerous for you too. Dangerous for you to bring up because you're going to have reviewers, oh, you should put it in here, which you may not want to do at all for totally legitimate reasons, but yeah, opens you up to that. Okay. So here's another one. This is quite simple. All the time you get reviewers that just miss stuff, right? And so if there's something like they ask for a parameter and it's in the paper, maybe this goes to keeping it short versus keeping it long. What's acceptable to take care of that? Just referencing it in the paper, and is it viewed as cordial enough?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely appropriate to point out obvious misreadings or misinterpretations by reviewers, especially if those misinterpretations are the basis for them giving a harsh judgment on your manuscript. In your response letter to the editor, I think it's I think pretty straightforward to deal with those types of comments very politely, very straightforward, to not let emotion get into it and say, well, obviously the reviewers didn't read my paper carefully enough. I've seen that in response letters and it's a big turnoff. It's not a good idea to do that. Just be polite, be straightforward and say, yes, on page whatever, line whatever, we explained, we did that, or that's in there. Just be polite about it.
Yeah, you're professionals in the situation, and it reminds me of something that I consistently tell authors, particularly because I think we help a lot of authors who are ESL or emerging country researchers and this type of thing. And I think there's again, maybe putting the editors up on a pedestal or the reviewers up on a pedestal, and you don't need to be overly apologetic or concerned about whether that's viewed as impolite or inappropriate, that type of thing. You should, I think, trust some of your instincts on that. If there's an oversight, just point it out to them. That will probably make them happy. And then again, then they don't have to read through a long explanation. That's not being any extra polite to them. It's just causing more trouble than it's worth. So yeah, just point out those omissions, that type of thing, or something that they had for some oversight. Okay. And then, do you ever have any issues where you don't reveal a reviewer comment, or you have an editor? Obviously, sometimes you make a decision, but perhaps there's confidential comments or something that the editor is rejecting based on something that they're not showing directly to the author?
Yeah, that can be tricky because in many cases, with the journal I worked for and many journals that I've submitted to, submitted manuscript reviews to, I should say, peer reviews, you're often asked, well, these are comments that you want the authors to see. And then there's another field where you say, these are comments to the editor only. And in some cases, I would get comments that were meant only for me as the editor, that might have a different take or maybe be a little bit more candid. And in some cases, maybe a little bit less professionally phrased because they know I'm the only one reading it. But generally speaking, if I saw that the comments to me were broadcasting a different opinion of the paper than the comments that are being sent directly to the authors, I would see that as a red flag, because authors should have the right to be responding to the feedback from the reviewers and not be worried about an editor making a decision based on information that they are not privy to. The types of comments you might want to say only to the editor shouldn't express a different opinion of the paper. It might just be a different way of phrasing it, but I don't think that should be, I don't think it's ethical to be using those types of confidential comments as the basis for a decision.
Okay, so if you have a reviewer who's maybe indicating something that doesn't appear from the comments, this is where it's coming from. There's maybe more candid explanation for the reviewers to the editor. And so if it's unclear, you probably can't ask the editor for like, oh, can you just tell me what the reviewer said to you? But you could just ask the editor for more clarification from them, because what they're doing is interpreting it for you from their correspondence that they've had only between them and the reviewer. So yeah, if you're looking for a way to get more information, don't just ask for the reviewer comments that they're clearly not giving you. Just ask for them for clarification on any specific point that you think they're being a little bit vague in terms of what they're trying to get at. So
yeah, I think
okay.
that's absolutely fair and correct.
Okay, and then I just have a final question. It is related to references and this is probably field specific because I don't encounter this much, but the idea of outdated references or not enough recent references, I suspect it's more maybe for the field for both of you, also engineering, things like this, we see it more often. So well, what's your thoughts on that? When does that become an issue for you and how do you treat it?
Oh yeah, so that's a common issue that I've definitely seen. On one extreme end of the spectrum, you might see someone that cites basically every single paper that's ever been written about a topic all the way back to the 1800s or whatever it is, which is generally not necessary. So I think it's appropriate to select a few seminal papers if it's a topic that's been under study for a very long time, and then there are certain landmark papers that are not from modern literature, but are papers that people should know about. One example in my field would be a paper from 1941, which is the basis for astronomical theory of the ice ages. And that is a paper that you still see cited in many new papers, as it should be. But, so there are papers that, even though they're old, doesn't mean that they're too out of date to cite. That some of those should be cited, but not in a comprehensive manner. The opposite problem is that you sometimes see authors only citing papers from the last couple of years, and it leaves the impression that nothing important happened or was learned before those years. That's not good either. So I think you have to just be really careful and appropriate about the types of papers that you cite, but realizing that you can't be fully comprehensive.
Yeah, and in response, I quite often tell authors if they're because sometimes they get the criticism just like, oh, not enough recent papers, which is completely vague because recency doesn't mean relevance. And so if you're getting that comment, ask them what you're the missing work that you're failing to cite, like what's not there, not like, oh, you should have something from 2019 and 2022 and 2021. You have one from 2018. It's not the last 5 years. Like, okay, well, what was published then that you think I'm missing is what it comes down to. And if you can go and identify something, certainly include it. Otherwise, you just request, again, this is where reviewers have, like, you got to hold it up to their end. If there's something specific that you think is missing in those intervening times, but it's about relevance, the actual paper is not an arbitrary date on the paper. So Yeah, it's just, I know it's quite problematic. Sometimes they get reviews like that. It's like, what are you asking me to do? So, okay. And then I think that is it. Let me just see if there's anything. I want to remind people that I posted the hub in here so we can answer questions in the hub afterwards on peer ref. So if you have questions, we'll all be visiting there today, over the coming week, that type of thing. And so just ask your questions. I'm happy to answer them in there. You might get some nice discussion with other attendees in there to sort of address some of these specific issues that people ask about, scenarios that they've encountered, and you might get more people's experience. So be sure to go there and follow up with any questions that you think we didn't get here to today. Also, I want to remind you, you'll get the full recording of this. So not just the slides, but the Q&A. You'll be able to see AV's slide presentation, and you'll be able to get this full Q&A. So if you want to share that registration link with someone else on demand after, a student or something like that, absolutely go for it, because we think it'll be beneficial to most people. So is there anything else, anything you guys wanted to say before we wrap up?
I don't think too much. One thing I do have is that Joe has worked with us before. So if you do go to our free author resources on letpub.com, he's done a couple interviews for us, one specifically about being a journal editor with some more information about what it's like behind the scenes. So if you're curious about more information from Joe or about journal editors in general, feel free to click on the link that Clark just threw in the chat there.
Yep.
Again, we update articles every month, pretty much about a week or so before the webinar runs. So you can tune into our webinar and then also check out those articles about academia, publishing, career development in general. Other than that, I want to thank Joe for being an excellent guest today. It was wonderful to have you back as part of our LetPub webinar series, and we hope that
Thank you for having me.
we hope that
Yeah,
you'll come back again.
Thank you. And thank you to the audience also for a lot of really, really great questions. I appreciated being able to field some of those.
All right, I think that's it. Again, follow up in peer ref in the hub. We'll be there. Ask any questions or network among yourselves. It'll be a great place for that. And we will see you next month.
Yep, look for a registration invitation in your next email.
All right.
All right,
Bye,
take care.
everybody.